30 minutes of Q&A. Please feel free to post your question in the Q&A boxes, to which our moderator will then be able to offer to the panelists. And as a reminder, we will be recording this session and sharing it out on our YouTube channel afterwards. After a break, the next session will be at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the global implementation of the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration, to which I'll broadcast the Zoom link for individuals to join after the session. Now to our moderator, Dr. Amity Doolittle, who is a senior lecturer and research scientist at Yale School of Environment.
Hello, everyone. I haven't really had a chance to look through the audience and see who's all here, but welcome. I'm sure there's many familiar faces. I want to just briefly introduce our three panelists today. We have three wonderful women from around the world. First up speaking will be Dr. Susan Chomba, who is a social scientist with over 15 years of experience in governance policies and institutions in forestry, agriculture, and rural development in Africa. She works at the World Agroforestry Center, or ICRAF, in Nairobi, on issues of climate change, land tenure, equity, vulnerability, and gender. She has a PhD in forest governance from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and a double master's in agricultural development and agroforestry from the Universities of Copenhagen and University of Bangor in UK. In the forestry, currently in forestry from Moi University, Kenya. She is leading some of the large mega projects, or regreening Africa, whose primary objective is to reverse land degradation by scaling up proven and cost-effective technologies across 8 countries in Africa. I think we're going to have a wonderful contribution from Susan, who is passionate about applying research to make informed policy decisions. A big gap that we see often within our own teaching, and as we try to draw on good studies. That's very exciting. I think I'll pause before I introduce Minnie and Pamela, if that's okay with everyone, and just so we can hold on to Susan's background and hear what you have to say. And I'm sorry, but I don't know who is someone moderating time for me here?
Yes, we got you on time.
Okay, super.
Great, thank you so much, Amity, and thank you so much for this invitation. Just a point of correction, I have since left ICRAF. I'm currently working with the World Resources Institute as the Director for Vital Landscapes, but I take it in good stride. I worked with wonderful colleagues at ICRAF, and I'm sure that some of the perceptions that I'll be sharing today will really be heavily influenced by my experience working with the Regreening Africa program. So it's a big pleasure to join ISTF team again. I'd just like to mention that the last time I was in New Haven was just at the end of January, early February 2020, before the COVID-19 pandemic really struck us all. And the work that I'm going to speak about today actually comes from, it is a work that came from that particular conference. After the conference, we came together as a group of female researchers, people that I had never met before, who've eventually become very close friends. And we thought about how we can really bring in the aspects of political ecology into the restoration process. I'd like to recognize the work that we did with Professor Tracy Osborne, Samara Brook, Robin Chadzon, and Eva Garen, Victoria Guterres, Rebecca Lev, Manon Lafèvre, and Yonita Sundberg. Because what I'm going to share today are not just my thoughts or perceptions. It's really about this paper that we wrote that has since been published it's been published already. It's called the Political Ecology Playbook for Ecosystem Restoration. And really you can be able to find it freely online. So my talk today will focus about bringing the discipline of political ecology in restoration. And perhaps I'll focus on 3 key things. First of all is to set the context. What were the problems that we saw in terms of restoration not being able to address? And then share 5 key lessons that we learned from political ecology, and then leave you guys to really deep dive into that paper on the 10 principles that we do discuss in the paper about the political ecology playbook. So the problem that we saw, first of all, is that in restoration, and this may not be in restoration alone, but I think in a lot of development and conservation programs, there has been a lot of research that is showing we tend to really underestimate the power or the problems of underlying structures that really lead to land degradation. We focus very much on the proximate causes. We focus very much on symptomatic issues and really forget about underlying causes of land degradation, including poverty and marginalization of different groups, leaving the voices of different groups from the debate of land degradation, as well as decision-making processes. The second problem that we actually identified and delved in the paper was the tendency to value market logics and really undervalue or downplay social and cultural values that ecosystem play. The third problem that we saw was overvaluing, of course, the aspects of carbon, and especially in restoration. Yesterday, I was just seeing this article that came from The Guardian that was talking about the dangers of really looking at nature-based solutions as the main way of fighting climate change. And so it sort of shifts our attention from the need to decarbonize the economies and focus on these ecosystem services or ecosystems such as forests as the main way of getting ourselves out of the mess that we are currently in. We know it's not an issue of either or. We do definitely need to decarbonize our economies, even as much as we are focusing on restoration processes, nature-based solutions as a way of carbon capture. But when we use that as an escape or a leeway to give leeway to big corporates or companies to then not decarbonize our economies, then it becomes problematic. And of course, the other thing that we saw as a problem in restoration, and that still persists today, is the focus, a big focus on monocultures, on tree planting. We've even promoted the terminology now to say we are doing tree growing. But what kinds of trees are we growing? We are seeing a lot of tendencies to have monocultures, a single species or a few species, which really undermine some of the values of biodiversity that we may want to claim that we are contributing to, including, as I mentioned, social and cultural values. So really, those are some of the problems that we saw. But of course, I can't finish the problems without mentioning also the issue of restricting local user rights and access to resources. That's extremely critical. We know very well that we have come from far in debate around local engagement of indigenous people, local communities, and even under the UN frameworks, we have issues like free, prior, and informed consent. But that does still not mean that a lot of interventions that we are doing today are really looking into that. So then this paper really looks at how we can be able to address both environmental damage through land restoration, but also paying equal attention to social inequalities while catalyzing, systemic transformation through landscape restoration. So as I mentioned, I'd like to share the lessons that are really well outlined in the paper. And the first lesson is that we do need of political ecology is that we do need to recognize the deeper entanglement between humans and landscapes through dynamic relations of coevolution, responding to constantly changing social and environmental conditions. In addition, landscapes reflect social and cultural values, particularly of those who wield the greatest power in society. This is important because it suggests the possibility of evolving new values and practices more conducive to socially just and ecologically sustainable forms of restoration. So really, we cannot disentangle humans from landscapes. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is that ecosystems are deeply imbued with asymmetrical political economy and power relations. We tend, as I mentioned, to really look at restoration and other environmental interventions as apolitical. And we know very well that that one is a false, sort of approach. The power relations play out along axes of class, gender, race, ethnicity, indigeneity, and colonial histories. And these determine whose knowledge counts, whose values are considered, who has rights, access and control over resources, and ultimately who wins and who loses. The third lesson is that unequal power relations can lead to environmental conflicts, local resistance, and struggles for access to and control over resources. I think we've seen a lot of this happening in different parts of the world when we have power relations, unequal power relations, when the voices of the weak and the marginalized are left out of the table, and therefore we see conflicts. This is not just something that is superficial. We know that some of these power relationships really come from historical, and especially colonial and post-colonial regimes, and current development projects and restoration projects in particular do not address these historical dimensions. Instead, they tend to exacerbate them. And so they persist up to date. And in many cases, you see through inequitable outcomes from REDD+ processes, from restoration processes, where instead of bridging that gap between those who have resources and those who have power, we tend to exacerbate and expand it. So in terms of the fourth lesson that we outline is the need to emphasize that market solutions and technological fixes can produce problematic and unintended consequences. These strategies commodify nature and oversimplify ecosystems to the essential and marketable nature that capital can see. Framing ecological issues as purely technical obfuscates their political origins and risks consolidating power in the hands of experts, technocrats, and powerful economic actors. And the fifth and last lesson that we really highlight is that political ecology is that the management strategies often disregard the value of common property arrangements and local and indigenous knowledge systems, local knowledge, expertise, and regenerative practices. I think most of you will be very, very much aware of the work of Professor Lynn Ostrom, which really brought in the recognition that common property regimes do not necessarily lead to tragedy of the commons, that there are common property regimes that are properly managed and that can be able to help us, in fact, learn on how to restore areas that are already degraded. And so in contrast to dominant frameworks that erase socio-ecological values beyond the economic, political ecologists highlight the importance of supporting knowledge and worldviews that foster community and multi-species relations based on interdependence and mutuality. So those are the 5 key lessons that we really brought from political ecology through this paper. And in addition to that, what we really tried to highlight was then practical tools, what we call the principles. And these are 10. And I said, I don't need to go through all of them. There are 10 principles. And we tried to categorize them from the local arena to the national arena and to the international arena. Very much being aware that there's interdependence and interlinkages between those 2-3 arenas and how those principles play out. On the local side, we did emphasize a lot based on what I problematized earlier and the lessons and the 5 lessons that I shared, the need to privilege local knowledge and practices. So restoration does need to privilege local knowledge and practices. Secondly, restoration does need to ensure participation of most impacted groups. So most impacted, marginalized, as I mentioned, based on race, class, religion, and other socio-economic groups that may exist. And of course, ensure social, environmental equity and justice. Now, on the national side, we did align the need to align restoration practices with local needs and aspirations, but also align state policies to support restoration. And last, on the national level, empower representative local decision-making authority. Again, there's a lot of work that has shown local elected representatives do carry the authority of the people who elected them. And so involving them and ensuring that they're empowered as representatives of the people in local decision-making processes is extremely important. That does not exclude the voice of the people. It just means that sometimes you have to recognize the need for representation. Lastly, on international, we did recognize the need to promote regenerative interventions, prioritize social and ecological benefits over financial returns, ensure fair funding, and collaborate across country borders. So we know that most of these restoration interventions that we seek are not necessarily restricted by our national borders, and especially in a context like Africa where I work, some of these borders are actually very what we call fictitious borders that were drawn during colonial times. And so when you look at landscape approaches, most of the landscapes that we are working in do cut across those jurisdictional boundaries as well as the national boundaries. And so we do need to look at that and ensure that international level, we are looking at, we are really emphasizing and the aspect of crossing between the local, national, and international levels. So I think I'll pause there and really refer people to this particular paper. We can share it with the participants of this of the conference, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions that come out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Whoops. All right, thank you. Am I unmuted now? Yeah, there was a thing there. I wanted to see if we have any direct questions that we wanted to ask Susan, and then we'll also leave time for some discussion, I hope, among and between the participants and the panelists at the end. At the moment, I see one question in our Q&A that's directed towards Susan, and it asks, what is your opinion of educating local communities in the needs and services of the restored ecosystems? How do you suggest doing this? Through schools, public workshops, or other avenues? So there, I guess there's two parts to that.
And thank you so much for that question. And first of all, indicate that in my experience working with local communities, I did realize that it is us who need to be educated by local communities in terms of restoration. I have learned a lot working with local communities across different contexts in Africa. And there are, of course, aspects of knowledge that we can exchange. But I think one of the problems that I have seen is technocrats, experts, thinking that they have expertise on local knowledge, on the context, on what needs to be restored. So I always try to sort of put that on the opposite side and try to say, we are the ones who need to understand the local context. We need to understand as intervening agents. I'm talking about, researchers, I'm talking about NGOs, I'm talking about intervening agents who go to the local community and they see that an area does need to be restored. We need to understand more about the context even before we start educating local communities, educating, and I'm putting it in quotes, because what we've realized over our work is that, first of all, as I mentioned, the underlying causes of land degradation may not be visible to our eyes. What we may see is perhaps people cutting down trees so that they can be able to burn charcoal. And you say, hey, this is wrong. We need to bring you together and educate you on these negative practices. And usually we've seen a lot of approaches that tend to take that, with interventions that tend to take that approach. But in the long term, we have not seen sustainable results. So really being humble as external intervening agents and trying to understand those underlying structures from engagements with communities. They'll tell you the underlying causes, and they'll tell you what is the vision for restoration in their context. And that's very important for us to understand. So once we've understood that, then it becomes very easy to see how we exchange knowledge. I say it's a knowledge exchange process. So for instance, if you've learned about ways of addressing, for instance, soil fertility, and you've learned a lot about practices that can enhance soil fertility, then you can bring in those kind of dimensions with local communities in different ways. In some cases, we've seen contexts where farmer field schools are very effective. And in these cases where there are farmers already who are practicing something, and you work with those farmers and other farmers come to see, that becomes a very effective strategy, because farmers do learn from other farmers, and they know that other farmers already understand some of the contextual challenges that they might as well experience. We've also seen other methods, such as use of videos, use of communication, techniques that are extremely powerful. So I would say it's a suite of technologies that can be used, of practices and technologies that can be used to exchange knowledge. But I think the first starting point is the point of humility, that we don't really understand all the issues. We also need to learn from the farmers and therefore exchange knowledge on how we want to restore ecosystems and to what kind of a vision we want to achieve in the end.
Wonderful, Susan. I fully support your notion that we need to be learning more from community members opposed to educating them. And I think my question would be is I think that's easy for an anthropologist or someone who engages a lot with communities to understand and recognize the value of that. But then the actual work of implementing that into what might be projects on a different time scale or with different, I think we all know there's a pretty big mismatch between funding timescales and the time needed to work on the ground, particularly if you're learning the local context. And just wondering if you could reflect on that for a moment.
Absolutely, it's a very valid question. In fact, a lot of times when we are designing projects and even proposals, we don't even have time to go to the ground and really understand all of these dynamics. So there are so many assumptions that we make in our theories of change on how we see these things are going to, activities that we want to implement that will lead to certain outcomes and therefore certain kind of impacts. But I think even in our theories of change, there's a level that we have to accept that there are some assumptions we are making that we don't really understand. So my suggestion, especially in restoration, it's because it's a long-term process. Restoration is not something that you can do in a short period of time. And of course, some of the project funding that we get are short-lived. And so we need to think through how to bridge that gap. And in most cases, it's to be very pragmatic about what is possible within the timeframes that we've got. So there are, again, different tactics that we can employ. So for instance, if we really don't understand the context and we have a one-year project that we do need to get to the ground, it's being realistic on what can be achieved within that 1 year, and also being realistic on that we do need to build structures so that local communities and perhaps local leaders who have already been doing most of work with the communities can be able to take over and continue with whatever the project had already started. But we can't claim, for instance, that we can really do a restoration program and finish it and see results in 1 year. Of course, there are some results that we can see. Trees are planted, you can see seedlings are growing, but it doesn't mean that we can be able to measure impacts on soil changes, impacts on hydrological functions, impacts on biodiversity, impacts on local livelihoods. Those ones will come much later. So having that kind of a horizon understanding, even when we are designing projects, and knowing very well that there are areas that will not be able to achieve within the time frame of the project would be crucial.
So it sounds a lot like you're saying that people in their funding applications need to be really direct in their theory of change. And for those of us that believe in the value of local communities and local knowledge, the theory of change that you might work through is this process of initiating a project and being able to build structures to allow local people to take the leadership roles as it moves forward. Yeah. Do we have time for another question, or should we? I see Luis Pedro has a great question that I want to pin for all three people, maybe as we get towards the end. And I see one other question that maybe we'll also hold for the panel. Yeah.
Yes, I think we should move to Minnie. Yeah.
Oh, so I introduced Minnie. Thank you, Susan. Can we all have a round of applause virtually or something for Susan? That was wonderful. And I highly encourage people to read the paper that she wrote with many co-authors, which is really, really useful. So now I'd like to introduce Minnie Degawan, who is an Igorot from the Cordilleras area of the Philippines, a lifetime activist for Indigenous peoples and their rights. Started when she was a young student, supporting the struggle of the Kalinga people for justice, and their anti-dam leader was killed in 1982. So she then joined the Cordillera People's Alliance and was elected as the Secretary General. And in this capacity, she has been very involved in many of the international negotiations and processes that are so important for Indigenous people's rights, such as the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. She's been a pioneer of the Indigenous caucuses and has led to the creation of the International Alliance of Indigenous and Traditional Peoples of the Tropical Forests in 1990. And then went on to head the Indigenous Peoples Legal Resource Center, which lobbied for and critiqued laws on Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. She's been a regional coordinator of the IOL project, which focuses on aspects of the UN Declaration of Indigenous People and their rights. Let's see, currently, she's the director of the Indigenous Peoples Program in Conservation at Conservation International, where she is working with how conservation and Indigenous people's rights intersect and what's the best work that can be done at that intersection. So welcome, Minnie. It's nice to see you.
Thank you so much. Charlie will start the slides. Salamat. Isan yaman, isan imbitasyon nyo, isan na ay tungtungan. Gawis nan madagop, may mayat kumano, man iinilat ako, yaman aasideng tako, tagawis nan man adalan. Thank you for this opportunity to join you in this crucial conversation. As an Indigenous person, I value all the opportunities that enable us as a community to get together to share our thoughts, experiences, and lessons. In my community, we usually have these conversations around the fire, which is why my background is a little fire, and hope that some of the heat of the fire will reach you wherever you are. So thank you again. Today, I will be sharing some of my community's values and principles in the hopes that we learn something from them and put them into practice as we grapple with the genuine need for restoration and recovery. Next, please. Sagada is a small agricultural village in northern Cordillera here in the Philippines. It has a population of 12,000 more or less Igorot people. And although the American missionaries made it the center of their education and missionary activities, it has managed to hold on to many of its traditional practices, notably in resource management. Some of the practices surrounding the different stages of life reflect the close relationship between people and nature. For instance, change happens not just in a family, but in the whole community on many levels when a child is born. For one, both parents lose their identities, as they are now referred to, and become known as the mother or the father of. And so usually 2 to 3 weeks after birth, the gubbao or the naming ceremony is performed. A child's name is chosen from the names of ancestors, and each side proposes a name with a justification on why. This is one of the many ways by which family history is passed on. Once there is an agreement on the child's name, this becomes a couple's identity. Next, please. After the gubbao, the father and grandfather would be tasked to go and plant a tree in their lot. The excess umbilical cord of the child is buried under the seedling. It is believed that doing this will ensure that the child will always have a place to return to. It also ensures that the child will have something to use in his or her future life. But what is the significance of the name change for the couple? It is a constant reminder that they are no longer individuals, but they are now a collective unit and have a responsibility to ensuring that the child grows up to be a productive part of the community. Both parents will be judged by how well they raise their children, and it will not be based on material acquisition, but rather on how they will interact with the community in its wholeness. As parents, they now undertake the journey of becoming ancestors, with all the responsibilities that go with that term. Next, please. From a young age, children are taught the community rules. These are the usual universal rules of not hitting a playmate, not lying, sharing your food, and not wasting any of nature's gifts. These are all universal rules. But there is one particular rule that defines the people of Sagada. There are 3 levels of caution that a child will hear from his parents or elders, and these are ngawi, something is wrong, and punishment is often immediate. Lawa, meaning the spirits will be offended, and inayan, the impact of the action is not immediately seen or felt, but will affect the entire community. It is ngawi to hit your playmate, especially if they are smaller than you are. It is ngawi to tell a lie. It is lawa to be out playing in the yard when the elders are doing the annual march to the sacred grounds during the bugnas. It is lawa to drink rice wine without making a symbolic offering to the spirits. One can make amends when either ngawi or lawa have been committed. But doing something inayan requires much more. Next, please. Inayan does not have an exact translation as it describes an entire relationship of not just an individual to another, but rather it describes one's relationship with Batawa. Batawa for the people of Sagada means the earth, including the spirits and those yet to be born. So when one invokes Inayan, it is a reminder to take into account those who have gone before us and those yet to be born, and those that we do not see but are very much around us. When one does something Inayan, an imbalance occurs, and its effects are far-reaching. For children, this is something hard to grasp, but due to constant invocation, it becomes part of their consciousness, and they grow up knowing what is Inayan. Inayan is often invoked on issues related to access and use of natural resources, specifically water, forests, and minerals. Children are taught that water sources are bodies, the rocks that ring the forests, or the caves where our ancestors are resting are sacred. As such, these are not to be dirtied or destroyed. One can swim in the river and climb the rock formations, but one should never deface these. It is Inayan to restrict water from the Batangan from following its course. One can take water from it, but its natural flow should not be hindered, nor should it be salt nor polluted. To do so would be considered disrespectful to those who guard this. Among the dreaded punishments for such an action would be the drying up of the water source. So the impact is not limited to just the individual, but to the entire community for failing to instill Inayan. And as children grow older and are allowed to go with their parents to gather firewood or do farm work, more rules are drummed into their heads, such as not wasting fruits from the forest. No one gathers more than what is needed. If they do that, they have to share it with the neighbors. It is Inayan to throw this away. It is believed that if the fruits of the forest are wasted, then this will soon disappear. The rules governing forest use are many, but revolve around the principle of taking only what you need. One can cut trees to build their houses, but never ever sell wood. And such trees must come from one's own batangan. Next, please. Property rights are well defined in Sagada and are determined by the amount of labor that was invested in it. Sweden farms are privately owned and passed from one parent to child. Batangan or the pine forests are family owned. Ownership is traced to those who first planted and took care of these. Both the trees and the land are family owned. Clan members can gather from the batangan, especially wood for use in death rites. Timber for housing is also allowed. The pagpag, which is the mossy forest, is considered a community resource because little labor is needed to maintain it. It is meant for grazing of cows and gathering of food, such as mushroom, berries, beetles, and leaves. Wood required for community rituals is taken from the communal forest. Again, taking more than what is needed is frowned upon. The care of the pagpag is a community responsibility, and therefore it is Inayan not to help in putting out forest fires. Despite the oft-repeated Inayan, children will never get a clear response on what will happen when one does something that is Inayan. Instead, one hears, Inayan di mangikikan is di. Aunit mun sublikan tiyanan inikana, or she should not have done that. It will come back to them. But even with such ambiguity, children take to heart Inayan and grow up knowing what it is. Inayan addresses communal issues and defines the Sagada consciousness related to their lands and territories. To invoke Inayan is to invoke the collective. And the collective is what differentiates us from others. Our collective way of relating with nature and with each other defines us. And I am proud to say that we take the concept of Inayan wherever we go. So it might not be our mountains or our streams, but we believe it is Inayan to harm these, as we believe that there are those who would consider them as their relatives. So what does all of this have to do with a decade of ecosystem restoration? I join all of you in welcoming this declaration by the United Nations, even if I kind of consider it that it is very late. But I would really like us to reflect on what needs to be done, where, and how. Next, please. Perhaps we start with the where. I often hear terms such as key biodiversity areas, areas of highest carbon stock, and other words that tend to exclude. In my mind, I ask who determines these things. These are often discussed outside of the communities in settings that are so far removed from the realities of forest communities, and with very little participation of the communities that look at this not as resources or capital, but rather part and parcel of their identities. Coming from a small community with no hectares and hectares of forests, I feel that our forests are being discriminated against in all these discussions. But our forests are as important to us as any other forests to the communities who depend on them. In the indigenous world, we believe in the interconnectedness of all things. So protecting a forest in the Amazon, but allowing deforestation to continue in the Cordillera will not bring balance. So I think that these qualifications unnecessarily complicate matters. Why don't we adopt the concept of Inayan and consider all forests, big and small, tropical or not, as our relatives, and therefore all needing restoration and care? And this brings us to the next issue to consider. Who will be doing the restoration? Next, please. Again, this should be self-evident, but it bears reiteration. Those who have depended, lived with, and stewarded these ecosystems would be the best positioned to undertake restoration activities. I have seen many efforts to regreen, to reforest our mountains in the Cordillera. And believe me, if all of this succeeded, we would have forests reaching the Pacific and the West Philippine Seas. The amount of funding is staggering. But why is it that to this day, we do not see any reforested areas here? Simply because the communities are not involved in the planning and sometimes even in the implementation. The government relies on consultants from outside the communities who come up with the ideas of fast-growing species, funding models, and other such concepts. Communities sometimes are contracted to do the planting, but afterwards there are no provisions for ensuring the survival of the seedlings. The few areas where some new growth has been observed are areas where the communities are primarily homogeneous and the traditional resource management systems are still relatively intact. And yet these are the same areas that have received little or no attention from the reforestation programs. Thus, I would argue that programs for restoration should have communities at the lead. Their participation at all levels should be ensured. And this should not be a token inclusion for the sake of checking a box. Participation must be full and effective. Next, please. But how do we ensure that this decade will be successful? We have to bring the technical and financial resources needed to the communities. We cannot talk of inclusion without also ensuring that the communities have the means to practice their systems. Much of our traditional knowledge systems are in decline due to years of systemic discrimination that looked at these knowledge systems as inferior. So there is much to recover and restore. Our youth, for instance, are being educated outside of the communities and are losing the values that sustained our communities for generations. Perhaps one of the positive effects of the pandemic has been the return of many of our youth to the communities and are now more engaged with the elders in learning the ways of our lands. And our elders are also learning from the youth. This is a common experience among Indigenous communities, that when the schools closed, the students had to go back, and they are now taking on some of the agricultural activities and are learning how to do the traditional food production system. And we have also observed that youth participation in community rituals surrounding the agricultural calendar has increased. So yes, our youth are relearning from our traditions while also imparting some knowledge, such as in technology. But we must ensure that this continues even post-pandemic. Resources have to go to the communities to strengthen their systems of relating with the land. The different knowledge systems, the traditional systems, and the Western systems should not be seen as opposing each other. Both systems are important to resolve the issues that we face today. Not one knowledge system is superior to the other. Next, please. More importantly, the policies that discriminate against Indigenous systems and peoples should be addressed. When the Philippine government declared that all lands 18% in slope and above are forest reserves, Indigenous peoples were considered de facto squatters in their ancestral lands. And when a national logging ban was imposed and harvesting of forest products was criminalized, several Indigenous persons were unjustly persecuted. Next, please. We must remember that traditional knowledge does not exist in a vacuum. These are developed when people can relate freely with their environment. Without recognizing the fundamental rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands and territories, there will be no genuine restoration. And a word of caution, while I speak in general terms of recognizing rights to land and resources, these take different forms depending on the context in which Indigenous communities find themselves. We cannot come up with an across-the-board solution, such as, for example, titling of Indigenous lands. The form of recognition has to be dictated by the communities based on their realities. Next, please. And now to the last element, the why. We have to reflect and be honest on why we are undertaking restoration. Is this to come up with glossy communication materials that would look good to funders and thus bring in more funding for our institution? Is this to grow more trees so that there will be more carbon to trade? Or is this to restore the balance in nature so that we may all thrive? Let me go back to my community. As I said earlier, it relies on subsistence agriculture to survive. Thus, our calendar revolves around the agricultural cycle. Many of the months are referred to by the farming activity being undertaken or by the names of birds or plants that appear at that specific time. Mid-December to mid-January is referred to as inana, rest. This is the period when the rice has been harvested, dried, and stored in the granaries, when the paddies have been weeded and cleaned and awaiting planting. This is the period when weddings happen. It is the time for the community to rest. More importantly, the paddies and the mountains are also allowed to rest from any disturbance from humans. It is the time for the community to take a breath and reconnect with one another. In allowing the fields to rest and in conducting the necessary rituals to keep the society intact, the community is undergoing its own restoration efforts. In their wisdom, our ancestors have realized the basic principle of allowing the lands to be rested and restored. Nunan ipugaw at mapanog at maninana, ngandikat ken nan batawa. If people get tired and need to rest, how much more earth? So when the pandemic affected our community, our elders instituted age-old systems of locking down and undertook various rituals to drive away the virus. In the conversations in the community about COVID, our elders point to the imbalance in the Batawa as the cause. They believe that we have steered away from the values of Inayan and that we have abused earth. They point to some concrete examples in our community: the building of hotels on sacred grounds, the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers in farming, which then pollute the rivers, the open pit mining being undertaken in parts of the Cordillera, the burning of plastic, the domestication of some wild animals that should have been left in the forest, and many more. In short, the elders believe that the rituals they are performing will not be enough. Much more is needed to be done, not just by the people of Sagada, but by everyone. But certainly there are some things that we as Sagada can do. To the elders, they fear that the community is losing its Inayan culture, and there is a need to recover this. If all of us would look at forests not as a natural capital or a resource to be extracted or something to be conquered, we should look at it as a living being, a relative, then there would be no degradation happening. So we should not simply talk of reforestation or ecosystem restoration. We should aim to restore that which has enabled many indigenous communities to survive and thrive. We need to instill the value of Inayan in every community. Inayan, in its simplest definition, is the interdependent relationship between all creatures, one that we must reclaim and nurture. Next, please. Inayan is also a call for justice, not just for people, but more importantly for Batawa. Justice for indigenous people is not so much about retribution as it is about restoration. So when I say justice for Batawa, the earth, it means we have to give the earth the chance to recover, to regenerate. And often we think we know best, from what to plant for best results to where and to when. But perhaps we should also be humble enough to accept that earth has its own processes for healing. So let us pause and reflect on whether we are aiming for justice, or is it truly to restore the balance between and among all of Earth's creatures? Or are we perpetuating the system that brought us to where we are now? To close this sharing, let me highlight 3 words from my community. A tree is batang, a forest is batangan, and earth is Batawa. This illustrates how my people regard trees and forests. They are the holders of the earth, and to lose them is to lose earth. Perhaps we should learn more by going back to our indigenous languages and values. And I hope that this decade enables us to recover and restore our relationship with the earth, and that the earth will experience justice. Iswis yagawis e agaw tako amin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minnie. That was wonderful. don't have too much time for questions now, and there's some beautiful ones, and I think we'll hold till we hear from Pam, and then we'll come back. But I just wanted to say, I mean, there's so many things that you brought up in there that we talk about so often in classes here at the Yale School of the Environment that I just wanted to emphasize. And so often when Western scientists talk about how do we use Indigenous knowledge, they get far too instrumental in terms of like what species or you know, these very concrete ideas. And what you've really highlighted is that it's this larger world of view about interconnectedness, holism, the relationships between people and nature, and the importance of maintaining that balance. And I also truly loved your point that while most resources are, sounds like, held in common by the community, you still have very strong understanding of property relations. It is not an open access, but a well thought out property system that may have common property aspects, but nonetheless manage the resources for long-term sustainability. And I just think those are such important notions about what's happening in communities in Philippines and elsewhere in the world. Yeah, there's just so much in there. But I think we'll move on to Pam and then come back, because it was beautiful, Minnie. Thank you. Pam, Pamela McElwee is a professor of human ecology at Rutgers and has conducted field work for over 25 years in Southeast Asia on issues of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and climate change. Her first book, Forests Are Gold, Trees, People, and Environmental Rule in Vietnam, won the EuroSeas Prize for Best Social Science Book on Southeast Asia. And she was awarded the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2019 to work on her next book about environmental legacies of the Vietnam War, or the American War in Vietnam, and the politics of post-war restoration efforts. She serves as a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And on the first joint IPCC, IPBES report on biodiversity and climate change, which I use in many of my classes. She's also a familiar face. She holds maybe the first joint PhD in forestry and anthropology from Yale. And we were classmates together back in the dark ages. It's wonderful to see you back, Pam.
Thanks so much, Amity. It's great to be back, even if virtually. I don't think I was the first to the joint. I think Eleanor Sterling was the first person who did a joint degree, but in good company, lots of good people are interested in this as intersection between environment and humans, as you know well, Amity. So you've been training such an important generation up there on these issues. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got a few slides, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study that illustrates a lot of the points that Susan and Minnie did such a wonderful job in highlighting for us. And my case studies are really coming from my work in Vietnam in particular, which I've been doing for the last couple of decades, and been able to do some longitudinal work thinking about restoration. And as Amity mentioned, this is a particularly interesting and acute question for Vietnam, you know, given the impacts of the Vietnam War and sort of long-term ecological damage. You know, what are the best ways to approach that in terms of restoration? How do we include communities, Indigenous peoples, as our two wonderful speakers have just highlighted? Vietnam is kind of a case study of where that can go wrong. And so I think it's worth thinking about it a little bit. And one of the things that I think, you know, in addition to the wonderful ways that Susan and Minnie highlighted these, we can also see a sort of absence of attention of these social questions in the research literature as well, not just on the ground, in terms of, if you actually look at the publications in some of our major journals, Restoration Ecology, Ecological Restoration, and so forth, a lot of papers still don't pay attention to those social questions as much as we know that they should be part of it. And so I was involved in one of these sort of meta-analysis papers that are highlighted on this slide that was led by Vicky Reyes Garcia, who I think is talking to the conference tomorrow. So hopefully she'll highlight some of these points. But this was a review that we did for IPBES, and we reviewed more than 400 papers, kind of looking at what are the ways Indigenous people and local communities are involved in restoration activities, and highlighted places where they've done tremendous jobs where they've been involved, but still there just aren't enough circumstances, as Minnie highlighted. Too often, things are decided elsewhere and sort of brought to communities instead of, engaging them from the very beginning. So it's problematic in multiple ways. And like Susan, who has this wonderful new paper on political ecology playbook, I was part of a multi-author team for a paper that came out just about the same time, these sort of parallel processes. So this was a multi-author paper that came out of a workshop that we had at the Society for Ecological Restoration meetings in Cape Town in 2019, again, just right before the pandemic. It was great to get a bunch of people together to think about how we can distill lessons from different case studies around the world in terms of people-centered rules for reforestation. So this is a paper that was led by Marlene Elias, who's that's now out in Restoration Ecology. I'll drop the link in the chat as soon as I get out of this slide deck. And our interest was really using case studies, and we published a special issue of Ecological Restoration last year with these case studies, and I'll talk about our Vietnam case study in just a second. But the lessons learned from those case studies, and these will be very familiar after having heard our previous two speakers, how important these are, right? The importance of recognizing the fact that not all stakeholders are the same. Just because you engage folks doesn't mean they're going to have shared understandings. And so there's a real need to have long-term processes. This is not a one-off sort of thing that one can do in restoration. To think about communities themselves as agents of change, that echoes what we've heard from Susan and Minnie. Think deeply about socio-historical context, particularly when Susan was talking about the need to think of restoration as a long-term process. I was like, yes, yes, yes. These are so crucial to understand these issues. Resource tenure issues, equity, the fact that a lot of restoration projects are so focused on single benefits is really problematic, because it not only, as Susan was talking, kind of can gear you more towards very instrumental market-based solutions if carbon is the only benefit you're thinking about, but it also really narrows your participation base when you're not thinking about the multiple benefits that can bring other folks to the table, other communities to the table. And we also need to be cognizant that not everybody is going to benefit from restoration. There are some risks and potential downsides, trade-offs, people not having access to lands for food production, for example. So these need to be taken into account from the beginning, not a sort of afterthought. So I think all of these points are ones that this audience knows well. So I'll move to the Vietnam case study in particular, and Vietnam is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's sort of pointed to as one of the countries that's made a forest transition, that it's moved from net deforestation rates to reforestation. And a lot of this is smallholder driven, that there has been a real boom in plantations of acacia in particular. And this is a sort of cautionary tale that if you approach restoration without thinking of multi-benefit forestry from the beginning, this is potentially what you get, which is a very single benefit oriented plantation system potentially. And so the primary drivers of this have been smallholders who have planted millions of acres of acacia, primarily to get short rotation. These are 5 to 7 year rotations of acacia, which are sold for wood chips. So you can look at, the top picture here, you don't get a whole lot of co-benefits from acacia. There's not much understory. You can't plant other crops. It's a very single commodity forest landscape that emerges. But because it's involved smallholders as the drivers, there's been this narrative that it must be participatory. If smallholders are involved, we must have done something right. And some of the work that I've been doing over the past few years has been about how this is a really kind of a misnomer and sort of misses out on some of the negative downsides of this process. So I and a colleague who works at Tropenbos Vietnam, which is a NGO in the central part of Vietnam, Tran Huy Nhi, and I wrote this paper that was in Ecological Restoration last year, where we surveyed all of the literature that we could find on Vietnam's smallholder-led forest restoration process, and then our experiences on the ground. My colleague based in Vietnam and myself, as someone who's worked there for a long time, I did a revisit to the place where I did my dissertation research in the early 2000s. I revisited in 2019 and I resurveyed 92% of the people that I had surveyed 20 years ago to sort of check and see how these processes are going. And we wrote this paper comparing the impacts of Vietnam's smallholder-led plantation restoration against the international standards that the Society for Ecological Restoration put out a few years ago. And there's 8 standards, and these are not social standards. I'll talk about their social standards just in a second. These are the broad standards, which are about both social, economic, and ecological processes. And we sort of went through and said, what is the Vietnam case? How does it match up against these standards? And so the first standard is it engages stakeholders. And we said, well, smallholders are providing their labor, but they don't get any choices about what trees to plant. It's acacia or nothing in most places. And they don't get the sort of long-term engagement to talk about the multiple benefits that they might want to see from restoration projects. So it's a very limited sort of engagement. It does not draw on many types of knowledge. There is no indication that Indigenous knowledge has been brought into policies at any level. Is it informed by native ecosystems? No, acacia comes from Australia. That's not part of the driver here. Does it optimize ecosystem recovery processes? No, although there is discussion that once acacia has been established in some places, that there might be a transition period where we could eventually plant native species under a canopy of acacia. That has not happened in most places. It's very hard once people get in this mode of I can get a big tranche of money every 5 years planting acacia. It's very hard to then say, okay, well, now we want you to transition to a system where it's going to be a 30-year rotation of native trees. There's a lot of economic instability that smallholders feel about that. So that's a concern. Does this restoration aim for recovery of ecosystems? No, which is a shame because, as I mentioned, the Vietnam War was in fact very devastating to lots of areas. And so there was a real need for deep ecosystem restoration of native vegetation and, and then hopefully eventually fauna to return. But because of economic pressures and this push that the government had to meet area-based targets, they set targets like, we're going to reforest 5 million hectares. And those targets drove attention to fast-growing species on as much land as possible. And we missed out on some really potentially good opportunities to do deeper engagement and deeper restoration. Was the recovery assessed against clear goals? Well, the goal was to plant 5 million hectares. I guess that's a goal. But the indicators of how we might have done that a little bit more carefully were really missed out on. The problem with working with smallholders, on the one hand, it's great in terms of, if they can be engaged in a deeper process and make more choices. We could have had a more sustainable system. There is a challenge with thinking about smallholders as drivers of larger landscape processes. It's much more complex. You have to, look at, getting villages to talk to one another and then getting regions to talk to one another. So it's quite complex. It didn't happen. It might be possible, but it certainly hasn't happened in Vietnam so far. And it just hasn't been part of this sort of longer term planning. That's just, let's get as much planted in the ground as quickly as we can. And the results have been disappointing. So we looked, in addition to sort of the broader standards, the Society for Ecological Restoration has this social benefits wheel that they have tried to promote in the last couple of years, looking at, are benefits being distributed? Is there knowledge enrichment, sort of picking up on those social indicators and their broader standards? And so we examined the literature against the social benefit wheel and found that really the only area where there was some progress for smallholders was about economic benefit. They're able to get these short-term cycles, brings money into the household. But otherwise, there were a lot of potential problems. Their benefit distribution systems have not been very comprehensive. Community well-being hasn't been included at all. And so we came up with, and I won't talk about this, but just to say this is a table that we have in our paper, which is open access. So I'll drop that in the chat and people can jump into that and grab that paper. But we looked at all of the social benefit categories of the Vietnam process and said, are there any positive impacts? What are the negative impacts? So one of the things that this entire restoration process in Vietnam has done is really solidified land tenure certificates for smallholders. And this was a very deliberate process because Vietnam in the early 90s was emerging from socialist cooperativization, and which had not worked. And so they were really looking for a way to break up cooperatives, get individual households as owners of and managers of land. And so reforestation became a process to do that, to essentially enroll households in taking over what the state had previously been doing. So on the one hand, there's some positive benefits of that. Secure land tenure is, generally considered to be something that one needs for long-term restoration. The problem is those land tenure certificates weren't distributed evenly to everybody. And so people lost out at that moment at which these reforestation projects started in the early 90s. And if you were at that point poor and you didn't have a lot of labor in your household, you weren't able to sort of grab those tenure certificates or register for them. And I saw that when I was there at the moment in the year 2000, when in the central part of Vietnam, this 5 million hectare reforestation project was really getting underway. I saw that process of richer households grabbing land tenure certificates. When I went back in 2019, I saw the outcome of it, which is households that had been poor in 2000 and weren't able to claim land for forest restoration had chosen a different economic development path, and that was to send their young people abroad. And so remittances were a huge chunk of the family household income for those households that hadn't benefited from forest restoration in the 2000s. So we actually ended up having this bifurcation of some households being able to claim land, make money from acacia. The ones that didn't have to send their young people to Taiwan, Korea, other places to serve as labor in factories, which they then remit back to the household. So it's been useful to see that process. If I just come at one point in time, if I just come in 2019, I might have said, oh, a lot of households are planting trees. That looks like that's good, without understanding that there was this longer history and there were a bunch of households that had lost out. And some have been happy with the path that they ended up on, which is overseas labor migration. Others are not happy. They miss their young people. They worry about those young people losing their sense of place of the local landscapes because they'll be gone so long. They worry that those young people may never come back. So there's downsides as well. So why don't we fix these problems? Why do we continue to have a lot of top-down restoration projects or reforestation projects like the one in Vietnam? I think there's a couple of reasons. We heard from our previous speakers. There's a lot of people chasing silver bullets, right? That, forest restoration is going to get us climate change mitigation. It's going to get us biodiversity. We're going to get all these nature-based solutions to solve our problems. Without recognizing that there's trade-offs with some of them. I would also say focusing on global goals like quantitative targets or these sort of overly general approaches like the SDGs, rather than acknowledging that restoration can be very different in lots of different places. Our previous speakers talked about there's a lot of money going towards restoration now. I would say that's true, but it's also dwarfed by the subsidies for continuing degradation of our existing forests, whether those are subsidies for agriculture or trade and so forth. So our financial system is still inequitable in terms of protecting native forests and encouraging their restoration. And quite honestly, there are powerful actors who have vested reasons for not including more local stakeholders in restoration outcomes. There in the Vietnam case, there were wealthy landowners. There were the acacia seed greenhouse companies had a real vested interest in not having diverse, naturally regenerating forests. They can make money selling seedlings and getting subsidies. And so we have to acknowledge that there are these powerful actors, and they don't want to do these sort of social engagements. And that's something that those of us that are interested in political ecology have to sort of continually reiterate. So I'll leave it there. I will drop the two papers that I mentioned. I'll drop those in the chat so people can access those as well.
Thank you, Pam. That was fabulous. So we have just about 20 minutes left, and I think it might be awfully nice to get all three panelists together and see if we can maybe pick up some questions that they could bring into conversation with each other. The first one, and I'll just lead off with one that's on my mind, and maybe some people can add more to the question and answer. But you know, all three of you basically touched on this issue of the need, or some of our challenges are the apparent need for scaling up, the need for speed, you know, big numbers, the need for globally understood indicators. And I just wonder if you could each comment on thoughts on either how to disrupt this constant message we get on the need for speed and scale, or provide some alternatives. And I know someone mentioned farmer field schools, which I know are also important in Philippines. But yeah, maybe we can start with that, and we'll start with Pam, who hasn't had a question yet. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this sort of constant need for speed and scaling up, and using these quantitative measures that, I mean, I find the SDGs deeply frustrating and probably limiting, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we can do is what I think everybody on this panel does so well, which is highlight the failures of when those become our priority indicators, which is you get exclusionary problems where people, you know, can't access funds, or they can't, or their lands become converted and so forth. So I think highlighting the dangers of those overly fast, overly quantitative targets is really useful. And I think it gets through to some people. I will say for our work in Vietnam, one of the things that we have done, it hasn't had as much effect as I wish it would have, but partnering with NGOs on some of our research projects is something that we've done. So I mentioned Tropenbos. I've also partnered with Pan Nature, which is another local NGO, and getting them to do things like policy briefs. So our paper that was published in Ecological Restoration was published in English. We made it open access, but I knew that wasn't going to be enough. And so Pan Nature essentially translated it for us, turned it into a policy brief, and then took it to the Ministry of Forestry, who was making their next 5-year plan. And they said, yes, thank you. We will try to acknowledge these that are, you know, and try to be a little less acacia centric and try to be a little more inclusive. And they're going to try to increase their subsidies for smallholders to encourage them to do more native tree restoration, which much longer time cycle. So they need a sort of upfront subsidy that's much, much bigger. You know, so sort of nibbling around the edges on some of those projects, I think is an important role for researchers. But I'd love to hear from Minnie and Susan if they have additional suggestions on how to do this.
Yeah, Susan, why don't you start, and then Minnie can bring us home on that.
You know, that question just got me thinking, because on one hand, we constantly hear messaging that, we are in a crisis. It's now called the climate crisis. And so we need to do something urgently. And in fact, a lot of times you'll hear like, whatever action we were supposed to take it yesterday or last year or 10 years ago. Now it's too late. And so we have set for ourselves these very ambitious targets. Equally, Pam, you will be aware of the AFR 100, which is an ambition to restore 100 million hectares in Africa by 2030. And then each country gets their targets, area-based targets, as you mentioned. Kenya, like where I come from, 5.1 million hectares must be restored. It was very interesting that a paper that came out, I think, 2 years ago, immediately after the AFR 100 commitments, was actually showing some countries have even committed areas that were bigger than the country. Anything that is, that will have potential for restoration. So we need to recognize that this messaging is also driving a lot of the kind of dangerous restoration practices and interventions that we are seeing, and that in our attempt to be able to solve a problem, we might end up creating bigger problems. We are already seeing that happening. In our attempt to try and cover huge areas with trees, we are seeing, with the risk of repeating ourselves, monocultures, fast-growing monocultures that have got nothing to do with the kind of ecosystem services that we want to see. So I think it's kind of a very complex thing, because nobody wants to say, we should take longer, because then people will say, which world are you living in? We are seeing the storms, we are seeing the sea rising, and we need to do something, and we should have done it yesterday. So get on and restore 100 million hectares in Africa. But I think what we are seeing now, we need to have a more thoughtful process. We need to be saying, if we don't want to end up with results that are worse than where we started or where we are currently, some of these processes like restoration need to be thought through. They need to be locally led. They need to be owned, as Minnie completely mentioned, in areas, most of our lands that are currently under forest protected. They are under indigenous people, local communities in the Congo Basin as well. And we can learn so much that we don't need to rush the process. We need to have, I think what we should be rushing, if you ask me, is to decarbonize our economies. It's to really, it's where the source, it's cutting emissions from the source and then doing the carbon capture and restoration through nature-based solutions in a thoughtful and sort of sensible manner.
Yes. No, I think it's to respond to that question that I deliberately started my sharing by focusing on my community, because one of the things that we forget is we always talk about indigenous peoples, indigenous lands, and we talk about the Amazon, Borneo, even Congo Basin, forgetting that these are territories of many, many indigenous communities who are diverse. Even the term indigenous peoples has tended to put us as one homogeneous being. We are not, we are diverse. Our territories are diverse, they are small. And all this talk about scaling up, going bigger, better, bigger is not always better. In fact, small is beautiful. And if we only dive deep into those different communities, the connections of all those territories, the different territories will be big. And the amount of money we do not need, I mean, when they talk of $100 million for reforestation, where does it go? Whereas if we talk of $1,000 or 10,000 for one community, that goes a long way. So I think we need to get out of this idea that bigger is better. But again, going back to where we all started, it's not just Indigenous peoples who started out smaller communities, and it is the smaller communities who have resilience because they are able to have better relations with each other and with their environment. So I think the more we talk about, the territories in their concrete expressions, Indigenous peoples in their different peoples, I think the better.
Right. So specificity and detail of context, both historically and culturally, these are my mantras, are so important for us, but they're not the stuff that make makers necessarily happy. Let's see. I wonder, do any of the other folks want to bring up something from the chat or the Q&A session? Yeah, what tools have we got to influence related policies on the ground as we think about the bond challenge and the, million-acre restoration efforts? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I would just say, sort of echoing this idea that these large-scale targets, these global targets, are implemented by national countries. And so in some cases, as Susan pointed out, they're pledging way more than they're actually able to do. So at least from my experience in Southeast Asia, there is wiggle room for NGOs and Indigenous peoples organizations and researchers to help, because these governments, at least for Vietnam, they sign on to everything, just like, yeah, restoration sounds good. And then they come home and they're like, oh, well, okay, now we have to figure out how to actually do this. And if you get to know the right people in the right places and the right ministries and so forth, it is possible to get the message out about the need to be cognizant of these social and economic challenges that plague restoration. So I would say, to everybody that's listening, to find those entry points. Sometimes it seems sort of overwhelming, like it's, it's this bandwagon, everybody's jumping on it. How are we going to solve it? Find the places where you can, sort of find that slightly open door and like shove your way in and be like, this is how I can help you pay attention to these issues, and you'll have a better outcome. And so urge people to do what they can, where they can.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, in the Philippines, right? There are many community groups that work on native tree species reforestation, right? And the more support we would give to community groups who are doing this work of native species reforestation, perhaps the more positive outcomes we would see. So I
would just add on that point. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just a real quick thing. Lack of seeds, lack of native tree species is a huge problem in these places. Like for Vietnam, the acacia companies, are making a ton of money, and they've saturated the market. And I know this is a problem in Latin America as well. If we had financial support for Indigenous communities to run seed nurseries for native species, we would be in such a better place. And I do not know why funders are not prioritizing that. It boggles my mind. To me, that is like so obvious that we need to be doing that.
So we just need to give a call out to the work of Mark Ashton and LT and Eva Guerin here, who have done so much work on supporting native species nurseries and the value of that work. It doesn't show up in our policies or in our big statements, but it's incredibly valuable. So I think I saw Minnie or Susan, somebody was like ready to speak.
No, I wanted to follow up on that. Part really of the problem is funders. For instance, the Global Environment Facility, which is supposed to be funding projects for restoration and recovery of nature, is so focused on this idea of global environmental benefits. And it has to be in the millions of hectares or in the millions tons of gigatons of carbon. And I think Indigenous peoples have started, saying, if you want these GEBs to be delivered, they have to be delivered community by community. It cannot be delivered from from out there, because there's nothing out there that can deliver that, but it's in the community. So we are actually lobbying these funding institutions to direct its funding streams directly to communities rather than giving it to big NGOs, because then if it's given to big NGOs or it's big monies, then it has to be huge. Whereas if they go directly to the communities, it can be smaller. So I think support for this kind of call by Indigenous peoples would be very, very welcome. And I think would go a long way in ensuring that there is reforestation and recovery happening at the grassroots. So thank you.
We
So
have,
maybe
we have
just
5 minutes. So Susan, yeah, you go ahead.
No, please, if you, I just wanted to mention that just in addition, I think there's something that Minnie mentioned about letting nature also take its course. And, you know, in the Regreening Africa program that I was very happy to be reminded of the great time that we had learning there. Most of our countries that we were focusing on, especially in the Sahel, you know, that's the arid and semi-arid areas, just, you know, south of the Sahara Desert. You have a lot of potential with a practice that we call farmer-managed natural regeneration. And farmer-managed natural regeneration, in fact, I want to say it's glossally called farmer-managed natural regeneration. It actually is natural regeneration. It is letting nature take its course. Of course, then there's an aspect of management where some farmers can come in, where it's not, they can then be able to prune and get some of the immediate benefits from trees like firewood and fodder, but you're really letting nature take its course. And in that particular context, you deal with the challenges that are to do with, you know, with maybe livestock movement and poor policies surrounding trees. So I'll give you a very quick example. In a country like Niger, which is one of the big success cases of land restoration through farmer-managed natural regeneration, over 5 million hectares basically restored through these natural regeneration techniques. And when we look at what were the policy drivers that enabled that, it's not necessarily, you know, the big policy agendas that we set. It was really government agencies getting their fingers off the local communities and stop imposing, you know, rules against tree cutting, you know, and rules against tree ownership, letting communities have that ownership and the liberty and legitimacy to lead their restoration process. So it was actually the contrary. Nobody needed to go and formulate policies and effectively trying to follow what communities are doing. It's actually getting their hands off communities and letting communities run the show. So we've seen that and we know it's possible. And I like Pamela's question. So why is it not happening at scale? Because there's still these political economy dimensions of different vested interest in restoration process in trees. And that limits the ability of local communities to really run the show of restoring lands.
Well, I want to ask the question, is all the questions brought up in the Q&A session being captured? Because there's a lot of really, really good questions in there that I think it would be nice to have these in our conversations as we move forward. But I think it seems like the right note to end with is get your hands off the communities. I like that. I think once Michael Dove said, do less. And just the idea is that we need to be supporting the in situ initiatives of people more in tune with what's happening in the local context. And less in line with what we feel external standards are driving. And so whatever the role of NGOs and researchers and academia, I would say is just promoting that message that we need to be thinking about deeper, more meaningful engagement with community members in order to support them. So I often get the question from students around land titling, like, what is best? Do we support land titling or not? And I think the answer should, because we can see sometimes some negative effects from land titling, as Pamela mentioned, when people get squeezed out. I think the answer always has to be, what does the community want and how to support that? Not what does academia or research or outsiders say models the best, but what does the community want? And I hate always having the last word. Maybe one of our fearless leaders can have the
Yes,
last.
I think you did such a great job summarizing some of these points that we've had in this webinar. And I would love to offer my sincere gratitude for all of our panelists today, Susan, Minnie, and Pamela, and our lovely moderator, Dr. Amity Doolittle. On behalf of the student organizing team at ISTF, we've had so many takeaways, focusing on local context, focusing on valuing the social elements in forest restoration. And now we have a transition into the next session on global implementation of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. I think we can bring all of these takeaways there as well. We'll have Robin Chasdon and Kara Van Austin as our engaging speakers. And I will post the Zoom link in the chat now. That will be beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we also remind you to attend the live pitch event to vote on this year's Innovation Prize via Zoom this Friday at 2:30, and have a live virtual Q&A session on Saturday morning. So see you at the next event, and thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.